A video about the different looms and so on that you can use, the most common ones that you can get to do various projects and so on with. So I wanted to talk through that with you today, and also the sort of yarn that works best with different looms, and also the swatches and so on that you can make with these looms. So what you can basically get, the most common ones, and you often see these, and these are actually some of my favourite looms. I just find them very versatile and easy to use, but they usually come in a set like this. So we have a 41 peg loom, 36 peg loom, 31 peg loom, and the 24 peg loom. And these have a very large gauge, so the peg spacing is quite wide, and the pegs themselves are quite fat. Now these looms work really well, or should be used, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, with one strand of chunky weight yarn like this. Okay, this works really well with these looms, and in fact I did all of my swatches with this particular yarn, and you can e-wrap this in one strand on these looms, and it works perfectly well. So that's those, and I'll talk about the swatches that I made in a moment. Okay, now we come on to the long looms. So we have, again, a set of 4. I've actually got another one, but that's actually got a project on it at the moment. I'm in the middle of making a poncho, which I will share with you guys at some point soon. So again, they come in a set of 4. So we have this loom, which has got 62 pegs. This one, which is the next longest one, has 50. Oh my goodness, hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 18. So that's got 38 pegs, and this one, (26 pegs. So that's those 4. Now the thing about these ones is they have narrower pegs. Okay, so these ones give a much smaller stitch, and you can actually use a smaller yarn, because here's the thing, the gaps between these pegs are still quite large, but a lot actually depends on the peg size, I have found, rather than the actual gaps between the pegs, because these ones have very, very fat pegs, and so, as I already explained, they work best with this big chunky yarn. Whereas these pegs are actually a lot smaller. The gaps are still quite large between them, but the pegs themselves are smaller. And these pegs, I have found, work really well with one strand of Aran weight yarn. So this is Aran. So I don't know what the different weights are in different countries. I know they have different names, but I'm sure you can look it up. So you can see the difference between the chunky yarn, which is for the big looms, the round looms, Aran weight yarn, which is good for these looms. So, these are the yarns that you can actually use just one strand of on their own, rather than having to double up, which I don't really enjoy doing unless I'm doing it deliberately to use different colours. Like I've seen people make shrugs using lots of different sort of, their scrap yarn all together to make this multicoloured shrug. And that's in my opinion great, because that looks really nice and really cool. But if you're just knitting one piece like a sweater, and you just want it in one shade, it's better to use one strand. This is just my opinion, it's better to use one strand. It looks neater and tidier, and it's actually also easier to knit that way. So here's the long looms, and these all have the exact same peg spacing. Okay, so, and all of them have the same peg size. So when you do a swatch for these, they're all going to be the same size, because it doesn't matter whether you're using the biggest one or the smallest one, they are all exactly the same in terms of the peg spacing and the peg size, unlike these, which actually do have, if I take the 24 peg loom and the 41, you can see there is a big difference between the gaps between these pegs. So we'll get onto swatches in a minute when I finish making them. So that's the long looms. So the last loom that I'm going to share with you at the moment, I mean there are others, there are flexi looms and so on as well, but I'm not going to get into those today. The last one I want to share is this. Now this is my KB Looms Afghan loom, and this has the smallest pegs and the smallest gap between the pegs. Okay, so this gives really fine knitting work, and you can use smaller yarn. So the yarn that I say works best with this loom is 1 strand of DK. Okay, so this is DK weight yarn. Again, I don't know what the equivalent is, but I think you can probably just look that up easily enough. So that's like the finest, I mean it's not the finest yarn that you can buy, but it's the finest yarn that I recommend with these looms. And I have, again, used 1 strand on this loom, and it comes out really nice. And the great thing about this loom is, of course, it's much bigger. You have a lot of pegs, so if you need to knit something that's much bigger, then you can say knit on these. If you need more pegs, this is a great loom to work with. I mean, obviously, you know, you can tell by its name that this was, you know, you could to make blankets, but I'm not going to make blankets on it. You know, this is purely so that I can make things that are bigger, because although I can actually make things, you know, as I showed you earlier, I'm making this poncho on the 50 peg loom, even though I can actually fit onto that loom, you know, garments for me will fit onto that loom, sometimes you do want to make things that are bigger or looser or whatever, you know, a big loose sweater, or you're trying to use a stitch pattern which significantly narrows the piece that you're making. So for example, if you're making something that is in I don't know, 2 knit 2 purl, a sort of ribbed effect, that can actually decrease the width of your piece significantly, and in that case you do need a bigger loom to be able to get a piece that's big enough for you. We'll get more into that later on when I start working on projects and so on. So that's 3 different types of loom. So let's now look at swatches. So before you can really knit any patterns or adapt any patterns that you might find like on the internet or whatever, you need to really understand how much each of these looms can actually knit. And to do that, you need to make swatches. Now, I've actually gone through and done this myself, so you can use my figures if you want, but I strongly recommend that you do your own, because everybody has a slightly different knitting tension, and even if you're using, say, a DK weight yarn like I am, it's not necessarily going to be the same brand, and, you know, sometimes there is slight variation between how thick these yarns are, even within the same weight. So first of all, we have the long looms. Now, as I've already explained, these all have the exact same peg spacing. So they are basically interchangeable. And I did a swatch of 20 pegs using the Aran weight yarn. As I've already explained, you can use 1 strand of Aran weight yarn on the long looms. And it works perfectly, and I used E-wrap. And I ended up with a swatch of 6.5 inches. So that is basically the number that you can use to work out how many pegs. One moment, my cat is causing a problem. Hold on. Sorry about that. Yeah, so as I was saying, what was I saying? Oh my god. Anyway, yeah, so I got a swatch of 6.5 inches from those looms, and that will work across all of those looms because they have the same peg spacing. Okay, and so when you come to work out how many pegs you want to cast on, you can use this figure, and I will explain how that works at the end of this video, how to work out how many pegs you need to cast on for a project. So the next one I did was the Afghan loom, and again I used 20 pegs, and I used 1 strand of DK weight yarn, and I did an E-wrap, and the finished swatch was 5.5 inches. So again, you would use that figure to work out how many pegs you needed to cast on. Then we got to the round looms. Now, as I've already explained, the round looms all have slightly different peg spacing. And so I would assume that the swatch sizes are going to be all different. I did the 41 peg loom, 20 pegs, chunky yarn, E-wrap, and I got a finished width of 8 inches. So then we come on to the other size looms, which I would have assumed would have had different swatch sizes. So I made swatches, as I said, for all of the different looms that I have. And here's the interesting thing. I was always led to believe that the round looms, the large gauge round looms, had all the different peg spacing and were not kind of interchangeable. And in actual fact, when you stack those looms on top of each other, you can actually see that the peg spacing is actually slightly different. But here's the thing, when I made the swatches, they actually all came out the same size. I made a swatch on this loom, which is the 41 peg loom, which I don't actually have here because I've already unravelled it, but that came out as 8 inches. And these two swatches here that you see, the pink one was made on the 31 peg loom, and the grey one was made on the 36 peg loom. And in actual fact, if you stack them on top of each other, as I say, you can actually see a slight difference between the peg spacing. And yet when you put them together, you see, although you can actually see that the stitches are very slightly different sizes, they are actually basically the same width, and they come out as 8 inches, the same as the 41 peg loom. Now I haven't done this loom yet. I haven't made a swatch for this loom. This is the 24 peg. So I shall do that one next, and I'll be interested to see what this one comes out as, because honestly, if you put these looms together, I'm not sure how well I'm going to do this because I'm holding my camera, but if you actually put them together next to each other, can you see that? If I try and line up, can you see the difference between the peg spacing? So you would assume that these would give different swatch sizes. Maybe I'm missing something, but they've all come out as 8 inches, and including the one that I did for this big loom here. So I shall do the 24 peg loom and see what that comes out as. If it comes out also as 8 inches, then basically these looms, despite having slightly different peg spacings, are actually interchangeable. And so, for example, you could make the body of your sweater on this, and then, like on this big loom, and then use the smaller one to do the sleeve or something, which I originally thought you probably couldn't do, but I think you can, because all the swatches are coming out the same size. Anyway, I'll do the 24, and I'll come back and tell you what that came out as. Okay, so I did my swatch on this loom, and I got 8 inches for all of the other round looms, and for this one I got 7 inches. I don't understand why, because all of these looms have very slightly different peg widths, peg spacings rather. However, the only thing I can think of is that this 24 peg loom has much closer together pegs than the other ones do. If I take the 36 peg loom here, you can actually see how much closer together those ones on the green loom are. And that's the only thing I can think of. I mean, it's not a huge difference, it's only 1 inch. But I made all the swatches with the same yarn, and I left them to rest for the same amount of time. And I got 8 inches for the 41 peg loom, the 36 peg loom, and the 31 peg loom. And then I got 7 inches for that one. So basically now we've got all of these measurements for these different looms. And remember what I said about the long looms, all of the peg spacings for those are the same anyway. The only reason I did individual swatches for these round looms is because I assumed they would come out differently. But the spacing on these looms is all the same, so you don't need to make a swatch for each loom. So basically you can take my figures here that I have come up with, and if you are knitting something with the same yarn, i.e. chunky or Aran or DK, and you're using just a regular E-wrap, then you can basically use this figure to work out how many pegs you need to cast on. If you're doing any other kind of stitch, whether it's the garter stitch or say something like the tiny heart stitch or the figure 8 stitch, or particularly something like if you're doing a rib, like a two knit, 2 purl, I would strongly suggest you make a swatch before you start, because it's not necessarily going to come out the same, because different stitches give different widths on the same loom and with the same yarn. So, having got all these figures, how do you work out how many pegs you want to cast on for a project? Let's say you found a pattern that you want to adapt and it gives a certain amount that you want to knit. How do you convert that measurement on a knitting pattern, for example, to pegs? Because obviously it's not going to be the same. If a knitting pattern says cast on 72 stitches, that's not, you can't just take your Afghan loom and cast on 76 pegs and hope to get the same amount of knitting. It's not going to work. You need to actually convert it to the pegs. So let's move on to that next and talk about how you work out how many pegs you need. Okay, let me get onto the right page, and if my camera would focus, that would be very good. We'll see how it goes. So, let's say, for example, that you are going to use this loom. This is the 62 peg long loom, alright? And you wanted to knit on this loom with Aran weight yarn using an E-wrap. Alright, I'm just going to keep it simple for the moment and base it on the swatches that I already did. So we're just going to keep this really simple. So you're going to knit, or you want to knit, 19 inches on this loom using E-wrap and Aran weight yarn. How do you work out how many of these pegs you need to cast on? So what you need to actually do is do a very simple math. And obviously you don't have to write all of this out. You can just work it out in your head if you're very clever, which I'm not, or use a calculator or whatever. So you take the amount that you need to knit, in this case 19 inches, you multiply that by the pegs that you used in your swatch, and you'll remember that I used 20 pegs for all of my swatches. And then you divide that figure that you get for that by the amount that your swatch measured after you finished knitting it and taking it off the loom. In this case, for this particular loom, and using Aran weight yarn, I got 6.5 inches. So again, you multiply the amount that you need by the pegs used in your swatch, and then you divide that figure by the swatch measurement. And in this case, I ended up with 58.4. Now obviously you can't have 0.4 of a peg, so just use the normal rounding up or rounding down thing. If it's 5 or over, I would round it up to the next peg. If it's below 5, just round it down. Oh my god, this camera. Let's see if I can make it focus. I cannot. Sorry guys. So yeah, so in this case we're going to round this down to 58. So you would need to cast on 58 pegs of this 62 peg loom in order to knit a piece that was 19 inches. That's it, that's the equation. And you can use that with any of these looms using the swatches that we've got. Now, as I said, if you make a different stitch pattern, if for example you wanted to make a ribbed sweater or something like that, now ribbing is particularly important to take a swatch, because ribbing really reduces the width of a piece dramatically. And you may find that you need to use a much bigger loom. For example, if I wanted to make a sweater in just regular E-wrap, I could use this 62 peg loom, or I could probably even use the 50 peg long loom. If I wanted to make that sweater in like a ribbed effect, knit, then I would almost certainly have to use the Afghan loom, because I would need more pegs because of how much the ribbing reduces the width of your knitting. Alright, this is where it's really important to take a swatch if you're using anything other than the E-wrap, because otherwise you're going to find yourself with a piece of knitting that just doesn't fit you in the end. So yeah, you can take all of these measurements that I've given here, as I've already showed you. I'll just hover over them again so you can write them all down. If you're using E-wrap, and obviously the same yarn weight as well. Okay. So you can use those figures for working out, and that's the equation that you need. Again, I will just flip this over and show you. Wrong page. So there we go again. Yeah, and that's that. So we've talked about yarns, we've talked about the looms, we've talked about making swatches, and we've talked about how to work out how many pegs you need to cast on. And so I think I will end this here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.